Let's talk about interrogative and relative pronouns. Now, we've grouped these together because they're very similar. So if you look at interrogative pronouns, these include who, whom, whose, lots of who words, and then a couple more, which and what. And then if you look at the relative pronouns, these are almost identical. So we have who, whom, whose, pretty much the same, which, and then there's one minor difference here. Instead of what, we have that. And that's the only difference. So what's going on here? Why do we have two categories? Well, they have a different function. And interrogative pronouns have the function of asking questions. Think of an interrogation where you're asking questions and trying to find answers. So if you say, for instance, who did that? That's a question, and we've used who in the interrogative form. There are a couple of other words that seem to fit into this category as well. In fact, they do. And these are whoever and whomever. But these words are fairly rare, so you don't necessarily have to remember these. And the main ones are these five: who, whom, whose, which, and what, which ask questions. So interrogative pronouns are fairly straightforward. Relative ones are a little bit different and a little bit trickier as well. So relative ones relate extra information. Think of them as relating extra information, and they typically introduce a dependent clause. So they introduce a dependent clause. And we'll just give you a quick example here. If we say, Bob, who emailed me, we can keep the sentence going, of course, but we have Bob, there's a noun, and then what who does, what this relative pronoun does, is it refers back to a noun, and then it introduces extra information about that noun. So this extra information, all of this together, is the relative clause. So the relative clause, and a relative clause is a kind of dependent clause. Okay, so we start with our noun, then we introduce some extra information, and we use the relative pronoun to introduce that information. One final observation: there are a few other words that can act in the same way as a relative pronoun. So these are words like what, and when, and where. So these tend to be other parts of speech, but you may see them acting like a relative pronoun. So if we take an example here, let's talk about that time when we went, when we went bowling. There we go. When we went bowling. Then in this case, time is our noun. When is acting a bit like a relative pronoun. It refers back to time, and then it introduces this extra information. So we can see the same kind of pattern, even though when is typically an adverb or a conjunction and is not usually included as a relative pronoun. One extra thing to notice here, I said there was only going to be one final thing, but here's one more thing. That is often a relative pronoun, but as we've said in the video on demonstrative pronouns, it can also be a demonstrative pronoun, and in that case it's pointing to something. So this example here is of a demonstrative pronoun, and it refers to time. So which time? That time. There's a kind of pointing going on there. So that's it for interrogative and relative pronouns.